Good day. I'd originally intended to make this video about the talks between President Putin of Russia and President Macron of France, which have just taken place in Moscow. Instead, I have decided to make this video about the talks between Chancellor Scholz of Germany and President Biden of the United States, which have just taken place in the United States. I do so not because I think that the talks between Scholz and Biden are more important than those between Macron and Putin. Rather, it is because the talks between Scholz and Biden are at least as important as the talks between Macron and Putin, because they provide clarity and an understanding of the current crisis and its cause, and make it very clear the extent to which this crisis ultimately is about Nord Stream 2, this vexatious pipeline which the Germans asked the Russians to build back in 2015, which the Russians, perhaps to their own regret, agreed to build, and which has been a source of controversy and acrimony and political manoeuvring ever since. Anyway, let me proceed with a discussion of what actually happened between Scholz and Biden, and specifically what took place at the press conference in the White House that followed from their talks, which must be one of the most remarkable press conferences that the White House has ever hosted. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the comments that were made over the course of this press conference. Clearly, there was a discussion between Scholz and Biden, which preceded it. It doesn't appear to have gone much beyond generalities. It's abundantly clear, not just from what came out of the talks between the Germans and the Americans in the United States, but from other comments, including the comments made by the European High Representative for Foreign Policy, for Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell, that there is still no agreement amongst all the Western powers about what sort of sanctions should be imposed on Russia in the event of a conflict in Ukraine. But regardless, the most important event that took place was the press conference because, as I said, it provided clarity about the position. Now, the press conference in the White House began with the usual cliches and tropes and generalities from President Biden about how, NATO is united, about how Germany and the United States stand shoulder to shoulder. I recall that he actually used those very exact words against Russian aggression, that there will be massive consequences for the Russians if they do decide to launch an aggression against Ukraine, an aggression which, of course, the Russians have repeatedly and continuously said they have no intention of launching. Anyway, we got all of that from the President of the United States, from President Biden. And we got the usual cliches also from Chancellor Scholz. He went along with much of what President Biden had to say, though he did make it clear also that, as well as this desire for some kind of confrontation, the sanctions with Russia in the event of an invasion of Ukraine, the priority at the moment is to keep negotiations going and to try to make it clear that, yes, the Russians will pay a high price if they attack eastern Ukraine, if they attack Ukraine, but that it is the negotiations that are the primary focus that the Germans have at the moment. And Scholz made that fairly clear in his introductory remarks. And for example, he said, we need to discuss security in Europe. There is also progress, as tiresome as it may be, and we have not yet reached any very substantial conclusions but it is good to see that this format plays a role now. So, negotiations about security in Europe, not something the United States is terribly keen on, but then of course he also said things about the Minsk agreement and the negotiations there. The same is true for the talks between Ukraine, Russia, France and Germany, the Normandy format. We have this format, but we haven't been able to really use it in a productive way over the last few years. So now we have come back to that format. We're having tough discussions in that format, and that shows that there are ways that will lead us out of this difficult situation. Note, will lead us out of this difficult situation. He appears to believe that some kind of diplomatic result of the conflict in Ukraine could or perhaps will be achieved eventually. And then he explains that all the steps that have been taken, we're talking about sanctions, it's part of a dual-track approach of clear announcements with regards to sanctions that will be taken if there is a military aggression, and at the same time keeping all dialogue formats open. I think this is the most promising strategy one can have, and Scholz is perhaps giving more emphasis to the diplomatic track than the Americans were over the course of this discussion, and there was a great deal about that from Scholz. But then the interesting points began to surface, and they began to surface immediately on the question of Nord Stream 2. And it all becomes, at this point, extremely interesting and increasingly fraught. And we see the United States coming along, and there's a question addressed to both leaders from somebody in the press corps, and it receives, did you receive assurances from Chancellor Scholz today that Germany, this is addressed to President Biden, will in fact pull the plug on this project, Nord Stream 2, if Russia invades Ukraine? And I wanted to ask you about this Nord Stream 2 project that you've long opposed. You didn't mention it just now by name, nor did Chancellor Scholz. This is the question. And then we have President Biden's answer. The first question first. If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again, there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring it to an end. That's Biden. And then Scholz is asked to respond. And Scholz responds to this question: will they pull the plug? Will Germany agree to pull the plug on Nord Stream 2? And Scholz replies, thank you very much for your question. I want to be absolutely clear. When somebody says that, by the way, in a press conference, it means that they have no intention of being clear, and that's exactly what we're now going to get. We have intensively prepared everything to be ready with the necessary sanctions if there is a military aggression against Ukraine. And this is necessary. It is necessary that we do this in advance so that Russia can clearly understand that there are far-reaching, severe measures. It is part of this process that we do not spell out everything in public, because Russia could understand that there might be even more to come. I don't quite know what that sentence means, but anyway. At the same time, it is very clear that we are well prepared with far-reaching measures. We will take these measures together with our allies, with our partners, with the US, and we will take all necessary steps. You can be sure that there won't be any measures in which we have a differing approach. We will act together jointly, And possibly this is a good idea to say to our American friends, we will be united, we will act together, and we will take all the necessary steps. And all the necessary steps will be done by all of us together. So he doesn't mention Nord Stream 2. He doesn't say that Germany will stop the project. Biden says the United States will. Scholz, after saying that he's going to speak clearly, he evades giving an answer to the question. And then there is a follow-up question from, I suspect, a different journalist. And will you commit today to turning off and pulling the plug on Nord Stream 2? You didn't mention it, and you haven't mentioned it. And then Scholz responds, as I've already said, we're acting together. We're absolutely united, and we will not be taking different steps. We will do the same steps, and they will be very, very hard to Russia, and they should understand. Again, no, he doesn't answer the question. He doesn't mention Nord Stream 2. He doesn't say whether or not Nord Stream 2 will indeed be discontinued. And then there's a further question, this time from Michael Fischer, who's a German journalist. And again, the same question. And on Nord Stream 2, I would also like to ask, don't you think, with regard to the threat posed by Russia, Germany should already rethink its position on Nord Stream 2? And Mr. Chancellor, a question to you. Nord Stream 2, you said all options around the table. You're not mentioning Nord Stream 2 by name. Don't you think if you were to spell this out, you could win back trust as a strong ally of the United States? And then Scholz, in response to all this is further questions about Nord Stream 2. We are united, and the transatlantic partnership between Germany and the United States is one of the permanent pillars of German policy, and it will be relevant in the future as well, just as relevant. And this will be one of our top priorities, always. On behalf of NATO, we are the country in continental Europe that is making the largest contribution, financial means, and also military power. And we are the country that contributes a great share. We don't fully agree with you as who pays the biggest part of financial support for Ukraine. So since 2014, about $2 billion direct bilateral support, and within the EU, an additional $3.8 billion that is made available. So a substantial financial means to stabilize Ukraine, the Ukraine economy, and we're willing to continue with that sort of contribution. And this is the very strong and unbreakable friendship between our two countries. Part of this is that with regard to the difficult situation at the Ukrainian border due to the Russian troops, we have made it clear we will act unanimously in terms of sanctions. So again, he doesn't mention Nord Stream 2. He doesn't say that the Germans will pull the plug on the pipeline. And then again, a further question from, again, a German journalist. Mr. President, once again, a question with regards to arms exports. Do you think it is okay that NATO partners have different approaches here? And on Nord Stream 2, once again, do you think the current positioning of Germany with regard to the Russian threat is okay? And then Biden put on the spot by the German media. He says, look, there's no doubt in America's mind that Germany is an incredibly reliable ally and one of the leading physical powers in NATO, number one. Number two, the notion that Nord Stream T, as he actually said, Nord Stream 2 would go forward with an invasion by the Russians, it's just not going to happen. And then basically the whole discussion was ended. But note, it's Biden who's talking about this. Scholz is refusing to even mention Nord Stream 2 by name, and he's making no commitment that Nord Stream 2 will be discontinued if sanctions have to be imposed on Russia. Now, just in case you think that this is only Scholz, that it is only Scholz who has some kind of personal commitment to Nord Stream 2, the fascinating thing is that exactly the same thing was happening simultaneously in Kiev. The German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock has been in Kiev, and again apparently she was pressed by the Ukrainians to confirm that the Germans would block Nord Stream 2 if there was a Russian invasion of Ukraine. And remarkably, Baerbock, who is of course not just Germany's foreign minister, but was also the Chancellor designate of the Green Party during the recent election in Germany, and who has previously spoken out against Nord Stream 2. But again, Baerbock refused to be drawn on the issue. She refused to commit and refused to say that Germany would pull the plug on Nord Stream 2 if there was a Russian invasion of Ukraine. And now we have this report, and it's by Jake Tapper, and I'm reading his account on Twitter, and he reports the following. A source close to the Ukrainian government tells me that President Zelensky cancelled his meeting today with German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock because the Foreign Minister refused to say Germany would abandon Nord Stream 2 pipeline even if Russia invades, and because of Germany's refusal to provide any military assistance directly or indirectly to Kiev. Officially, this is described as a scheduling blunder, but it was not. It was intentional, the source tells me. Says the source, Germany is increasingly viewed more of a Russian ally than a Western ally by many in Eastern Europe and Kiev. And that's from Jake Tapper, who I understand is somebody who works for CNN, and he claims that he got this information from a Ukrainian source. It is undoubtedly the case that Zelensky didn't meet with Baerbock, and it is also the case that it's been explained away as a scheduling error. It is inconceivable to me that the story about a scheduling error is a true one. Certainly, Zelensky, however important his other meetings might be, would have found time to speak to the Foreign Minister of Germany, the most powerful EU state. It's inconceivable that Zelensky would not have found the time to do that. He clearly chose not to talk to Baerbock, either to ram through his point that he's unhappy with the Germans, or perhaps to avoid a row, most probably both. So there it is. The German government, or parts of it, are clearly now following an agreed policy, which is that Germany will refuse publicly to commit to ending or stopping Nord Stream 2, even in the event that there is a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, why are the Germans doing this? Now, I think that we need at this point to take a step back and understand a few things. If the scenario we've just been hearing over the last couple of weeks and months of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, of vast tank armies and paratroop formations pouring into Ukraine, capturing Kiev within 72 hours, obliterating the Ukrainian army in the Donbass, marching all the way to Odessa, if any of that were true, if any of that really were to happen, it is all but inconceivable that Germany would go ahead with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I mean, that would be a crisis in Europe, and Nord Stream 2 surely would fall victim to it. So the fact that the Germans are refusing to commit to something that would certainly happen in the event of a Russian invasion namely the cancellation of Nord Stream 2, is a very powerful indicator indeed that the Germans do not expect there to be a Russian invasion of Ukraine. That is the first point to make, and I think it's quite clear that the Germans have looked at all the intelligence. They've been well briefed, no doubt by their own intelligence agency, the BND. They've undoubtedly shared intelligence with the French, who have a, by the way, far bigger and far more sophisticated intelligence operation than the Germans themselves do. They've looked at all the satellite photos. They've spoken to all the right people. They know that this Russian invasion of Ukraine is a phony story. It's a bogey. It's not going to happen. So that's the first thing to say. But if they know there isn't going to be a Russian invasion of Ukraine, if they know that this story is a piece of fiction, it's all mythology, then why don't they just give themselves an easier time? Why not just come along and say, well, you know, if this invasion of Ukraine, which we don't expect to happen, happens, then of course, you know, Nord Stream 2 will be cancelled. Why don't the Germans say that, giving themselves a much easier time when Olaf Scholz has to face the White House press corps and field questions, and when Annalena Baerbock meets the Ukrainians in Kiev? Why don't the Germans just do that? Well, there is an overwhelmingly simple explanation for this, and I believe that it goes directly to the heart of this entire crisis. The Germans will not say publicly that Nord Stream 2 will be cancelled if there is a Russian invasion of Ukraine, because they know that if they said that, something would happen in Ukraine which would open the way for people to claim that a Russian invasion of Ukraine was underway, and then demand that the Germans follow up on their public promise to cancel Nord Stream 2 because of this alleged invasion happening. In other words, the Germans are not going to give a hostage to fortune. They're not going to say something in public which might actually trigger a war. And that tells us that the Germans don't believe that the Russians are planning or intending any sort of war in eastern Ukraine, but that they are seriously worried that the Ukrainians might start something in order to get Nord Stream 2 blocked, and that the Americans might be quietly supporting the Ukrainians in order to do it. The calculation being Ukraine stages some sort of provocation in the Donbass, perhaps launches an attack on the Donbass after this provocation, which is blamed on the Russians. The Russians, as they've repeatedly said, take countermeasures. This is then whipped up into a story of some kind of invasion being underway. And at that point, the Americans, the Ukrainians, the British, the Poles, the Baltic states, and the Dutch and everybody else bundle in and say to the Germans, look, this invasion is now happening, this Russian invasion is now happening. Now is your time to follow through on your public promise and to cancel Nord Stream 2. The Germans do not want to be put in that position. It shows that they consider the Ukrainians dangerous and unreliable, and it also shows that they don't trust the current administration. They believe that the current administration also wants to see the end of Nord Stream 2, and that if the kind of scenario I've outlined were to take place, the administration would be far from unhappy, and would support Ukrainian demands and Baltic and Polish and British demands to see Nord Stream 2 cancelled. So the Germans don't want to be put in that position. And that is why the Germans are refusing to make a public commitment to cancel Nord Stream 2 in the event of a Russian invasion. They don't believe the Russians are planning such an invasion, and they don't want to be trapped by making that kind of commitment into a scenario where they're forced to follow through on that commitment as a result of some sort of provocation staged by the Ukrainians, conceivably with the support and help of others. So that tells us a great deal about this whole situation, and it opens up many interesting thoughts about why we are in this crisis at all. And I'm going to suggest that in fact Nord Stream 2 is the actual underlying cause. It's the underlying issue. Nord Stream 2 was finished in September. There is a long process now of certification for this pipeline before it can start supplying gas to Germany. Germany clearly wants Nord Stream 2 to start operation. It clearly doesn't believe all these stories about liquefied natural gas from Qatar, the United States, and all that. It is perfectly well aware that even if this gas were supplied, it would come at an extremely high price. So it does want to see Nord Stream 2 completed. And I would add that certain comments that the German regulator has made have all but said, or so it seems to me, that now that the German subsidiary company has been set up, and as soon as the transfer of undertaking procedures are completed, then the certification of the pipeline will become a formality. Might take a few weeks and months to sort out, but at that point it would become certain. So that leaves only a relatively short time window, up to about late June, early August, perhaps September, to try to stop this pipeline starting operation. And the United States doesn't want to impose sanctions on Germany, its key European ally. If it did that, the entire fiction of NATO unity would disintegrate, and there might be a strong reaction against that in Germany. So we've had this story, this massive story about the Russian invasion being talked up in order to try to embarrass the Germans into making a commitment to cancel Nord Stream 2, a commitment which the Germans nonetheless are resisting. And that's why we are in this complex situation. Now, of course, saying all of this doesn't mean that Nord Stream 2 will now be completed. First of all, it's highly possible, indeed very likely, that some kind of provocation in Eastern Ukraine will indeed happen, that there will be some kind of conflict there. And of course, at that point, there will be massive pressure on the Germans anyway to get them to cancel Nord Stream 2. Now, I have to say that the Ukrainians at the moment seem none too keen on that idea, all the more so since the Germans are refusing to say that they would cancel Nord Stream 2 in that event. So it's perhaps unsurprising that people like Zelensky and some of his security officials are pushing back and saying, well, why should we put ourselves in enormous danger and provoke a war in eastern Ukraine in order to stop Nord Stream 2 if there is no guarantee that it would stop Nord Stream 2, because the Germans are refusing to say that it would in fact stop Nord Stream 2. So there is that problem with the Ukrainians, but of course it doesn't mean that that's not what might happen. And of course, if something like that does happen, then the probability that the Germans would cancel Nord Stream 2 after all would become very high indeed. Also, it must be said that if that doesn't work, then of course the option for the US to impose sanctions on Nord Stream 2 to prevent the pipeline working, well, that becomes much more real. The Trump administration came very close to doing that. Senator Ted Cruz has been talking about doing it, and he actually proposed a bill to do it. The United States up to now has not wanted to do it, partly because, as I said before, it doesn't want to destroy this myth of NATO unity, of Germany and the United States standing shoulder to shoulder. But of course there is another factor at play as well, because it seems to me, Nord Stream 2 is this project that has been giving the United States enormous leverage over the last few years over Germany. One of the great mysteries about the Ukrainian crisis is why the Germans, Angela Merkel in that particular case, brokered with the Russians and the Ukrainians and the leaders of the Donbass Republic the Minsk Agreement, which required direct negotiations between the leaders of the Donbass republics and the Ukrainian government, leading to a new constitution, decentralization of Ukraine, and a special status, autonomy for Donbass. Why Merkel and the Germans brokered an agreement along those lines, and by the way, was publishing and circulating numerous articles and stories in the German media, as I remember at that time, saying that this was the way forward and that this is what had to be done in order to secure peace in Europe. Why the Germans, having taken that step, then in effect stopped any further action to put pressure on the Ukrainians, to get the Ukrainians to implement their part of the bargain, that the Ukrainians had themselves agreed in Minsk. And it seems to me that, again, the key to this is Nord Stream 2. Few weeks after the Minsk agreement was agreed, Merkel persuaded Putin and the Russians to build Nord Stream 2. The Germans needed Nord Stream 2 because they needed Russian natural gas, pipeline gas at its relatively low price, in order to make up the difference as a result of Germany's decision to close down its nuclear power industry. So rather than hunt around for expensive gas, liquefied natural gas in the United States and elsewhere, and rather than do things which would cause Germany to fail its carbon targets, like keeping its coal and lignite fields open, Merkel came along to Moscow and agreed this deal with Putin to build Nord Stream 2. But of course, the moment she did that, she handed the Americans leverage, because the Americans at that point were able to say, or would have said, or perhaps didn't actually say, but perhaps hinted, that if Germany and France went ahead and put pressure on the Ukrainians to implement the Minsk agreement on the basis of the terms set out in it, well, at that point, the United States would take action to make sure that Nord Stream 2 was never completed. And that has been the leverage that the United States has always had over Germany and continues to have over Germany still. But then, of course, that leverage starts to end if Nord Stream 2 is not just built, but goes into full operation. So the time window for the United States, firstly, to exert the leverage that Nord Stream 2 gives it over Germany, and at the same time to prevent Nord Stream 2 coming fully online with all the problems that would cause Ukraine and which it might cause to the US geopolitical position in Europe, well, the time window is now becoming very short. Late June, perhaps later in the summer, August or September, it's the time window is closing. And that again explains this enormous pressure on Germany and this enormous scare about a war between Ukraine and Russia, which of course Russia is not threatening. Or so it seems to me. Except, of course, that it's not working out. The Ukrainians, as I've said already, are not keen to stage any kind of provocation in the Donbass. They don't want Nord Stream 2, of course not, but they don't want to be destroyed and defeated either. They know very well, perhaps much better than their admirers in the West do, that Ukraine has absolutely no chance of success in a battle against the Russian army, so they see no logic at all in provoking it. And the Germans and the French, well, they're pushing back. They're refusing, as I said, to commit to cancel Nord Stream 2. The Germans are refusing to commit to cancel Nord Stream 2, as the Americans want them to do. And Macron in Moscow, and I will discuss this in my next video, is now making it fairly clear that he thinks that the Russian demand for legally binding security guarantees is reasonable and historically just and well-founded. He had some very interesting things to say about this. And it's also clear that he now is moving towards getting the Minsk agreement unplugged and perhaps implemented. He has apparently acted to force the Ukrainians to drop a bill that was working its way through the Ukrainian parliament, whereby Ukraine would have made its own legal provisions for the Donbass in a way that disregarded the terms of the Minsk agreement. So the Germans and the Ukrainians are not playing, the French and the Germans are not playing either, and nor, of course, are the Russians. The Russians, who are undoubtedly well informed about all of this and have understood it extremely well. Well, first of all, they're going around telling everybody, well, we have no intention of attacking Ukraine. This entire story is a complete fiction. We're not interested in attacking Ukraine. All we want from Ukraine is to see the Minsk agreement implemented and implemented in full. But beyond that, of course, the Russians have used this crisis, they've capitalized on it to bring up the whole issue of the legally binding security guarantees. And as a result, they've shifted the whole conversation from Ukraine, which is where the United States wanted to keep it, onto the general issue of security in Europe, where the Russians know perfectly well that the French and the Germans and the Italians are sympathetic and open to their position. The Americans, for their part, don't want to go down the line of discussing this issue of security in Europe, but knowing perfectly well that their allies are unhappy, they've been forced into a position of negotiations which presumably they wouldn't have wanted initially to undertake at all. So this strategy of using this crisis, this scare of a war between Russia and Ukraine so far is not working. On the contrary, it is backfiring. It's making the Germans take public positions which are not helpful to the Americans. It's provoking the French to initiate their own negotiations with the Russians, with German backing, which the Americans aren't keen on, and it's exposed a major point of difference between Ukraine and the United States, with the furious row between Biden and Zelensky that I talked about in an earlier video. So it's not a policy, it's not an approach that so far has worked or which is working, but neither is it yet an approach, a policy that has yet fully failed. Whether it fails or not will depend on two things. Firstly, the ability of the Germans to hold the line on Nord Stream 2, to continue along the policy that they have so far embarked on, which is to refuse to discuss this issue publicly, to refuse to commit to cancelling Nord Stream 2 in the event of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. And here we see the importance of Macron's diplomacy, because Macron going to Moscow, appearing to work with the Russians, getting Normandy 4 talks underway, that gives the Germans the space they need to stick by this position of not committing to cancel Nord Stream 2. So that's one thing. And of course the second is the Ukrainians, because ultimately it is the Ukrainians holding the line on the pressure to start a war. I say that the Russians have no intention of starting a war. So far, the Ukrainians show no intention of starting a war either, but all these war scares that we're hearing obviously are increasing tension along the border, and it's always possible that somebody in Ukraine will crack and will do something foolish. Well, we have a very difficult couple of weeks before us. It's clear that this crisis is not going to end soon. It doesn't ultimately matter what the Russians do, whether they keep troops on the border, they're not there actually, or keep troops in European Russia, well, they are there, keep their troops in Belarus or withdraw them, which presumably they will once the exercises are ended. It doesn't really matter what the Russians do or what the Russians say. What matters is what the Europeans do and say, and what the Ukrainians do. And we shall see whether that line holds, and whether that line holds for the many long and difficult months that are between us and the final conclusion of this affair, which will be in the summer, when we shall see what happens. I will finish by saying this. If Nord Stream 2 is indeed certified, not certain at all. If Nord Stream 2 does go into operation, also far from certain, then of course the German and French hands are indeed freed, and we could start to see real diplomatic action starting to take place along the lines of the Minsk agreement through the Normandy 4 process, as currently pursued by Macron, in which case there is a chance, a reasonable chance, not a certainty, that this conflict in Ukraine could be brought to an end with negotiations thereafter following, possibly with a view to achieving some new security architecture for Europe. The last point is one I'm going to discuss in my next video, when I talk about what Macron and Putin said to each other and what their press conference reveals in Moscow, about which you will have to wait till tomorrow. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon in further programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please also remember to join us on our other platforms, first and foremost Locals. And here I'm going to say something to our friends, our viewers on Rumble. If you are following us on Rumble, if you look up, you will see a maroon button you can press, and that will take you directly to our Locals page as well, where you will see all sorts of exclusive content being published, where I do live streams on Wednesdays. Next one, by the way, is tomorrow at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time, 1900 hours London time. You can see all of that. You can follow us on Locals, and you can see that live stream if you wish to join us on Locals, either by going to Locals directly or doing so via Rumble in the way I've just discussed. And of course, you can also find us on multiple other platforms. Rumble, of course, but also BitChute, Library, ODYSEE, and SuperU. You can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to our shop and buy our amazing things there, our magic mugs, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all of the rest. And of course, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button, and please also check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a very good day until then.